a point was made this afternoon, or perhaps more than one point was made this afternoon about infrastructure. Now, having been ARUP's, I would be courageous enough to say most successful chairman of infrastructure in the last 10 years, you know, this is a topic which I feel very strongly about. And there was, again, in that 7-year period, there was a feeling in the beginning that sustainability is something that the buildings people did, because we all know how to design an energy efficient building, and isn't that a sustainable building? No, not necessarily. That's part of a richer conversation. And we actually had to work hard to create an understanding of what sustainable infrastructure looked like and why it was important. And I think the conversation that was starting to occur this afternoon about you know, urban communities and how the infrastructure was probably as important as the buildings that sat within that community was an important part. So one of the things that I've got involved with in the last 3 years is a group within Australia that operates to promote the concept of sustainable infrastructure. So there's been the Green Buildings Council of Australia, as there is here in North America. And about 4 years ago, we launched what we called at that time the Green Infrastructure Council. And we developed a system for rating infrastructure in the same way that buildings were being rated as to their sustainability. And what we have tried to do, with not as much success yet as has occurred in the property space, is to create an awareness that there is a value to sustainable infrastructure. There is a value to achieving an outcome which is acknowledged as sustainable. We haven't been able to create a market for it yet, as has been created with respect to sustainable property. But I'm becoming increasingly confident that we will. So in the last year, we've seen a number of major infrastructure projects in Australia where the government has required the achievement of a certain level of sustainability in accordance with the Infrastructure Sustainability Council's guidelines to be achieved as part of delivering the project. So if you're interested in that, isca.org.au will find it. isca.org.au will find it. I'll jump through this. So at the moment, our rating tool can cover those various types of infrastructure. And at the present time, you know, we've got about $35 billion worth of infrastructure going through the process of being rated. We have rated 6 projects that are now out there, so people know what a sustainable project looks like, in that they know that this project achieved a certain level of sustainability rating, and they can go in and find out what it was that led to that rating being achieved. So you start to create this understanding of what is good and what is not so good, which is what this is in reality all about. I'm going to jump ahead. So now I want to give you some thoughts on cities. So one of the, as Patrick mentioned, one of the things I was doing in my last year while I was chairing infrastructure, and then I became our global planning leader as part of my gentle sliding down the other side of the mountain. I became our global planning leader for 3 years, and in that time we were spending a lot of, and still do, spend a lot of time in the cities space. So in that period, in the period before I moved into the planning role, we had a global strategic partnership with the C40 Cities, and that had seen us deliver workshops in 6 cities, one of which was Toronto in, would have been, I don't know, 2010, 11, 10. Toronto, Sao Paulo, Addis Ababa, St. Petersburg, Melbourne, Berlin. So the idea was to go and work with the city in their city and to explore a particular aspect of what made for a sustainable city. And in each case it was a different aspect of city sustainability that we were working on with them. It was meant to be a demonstration project. On reflection, I don't think it was particularly successful. I don't think as an approach it really understood human behaviour sufficiently. So for the most part, the people in the city planning, etc. teams didn't really want what they thought was arrogant consultant from London coming along to tell them how to plan their city. And the engagement wasn't for long enough to create proper rapport. So I think there was a learning there which people have built upon. But we certainly learned a lot about those cities, and we have been doing work in lots of cities, and we've heard over the last 24 hours why cities are so important. And some of what I have here we've heard before today and before that. But we continue to hear that people think that if anything's going to save our society on this planet, it will be through what cities do, not through what governments do. And that cities are really the place where humans get together and where creativity and innovation is flourished and economic development occurs. And so, if you were an economist, it would be relatively easy to justify why you're spending, came to the wrong lecture, to justify why you're spending a lot of time in cities. But there are lots of other reasons why we should be spending time in cities, as you know. And I suppose one of the challenges is that each of us on the basis of whatever was our professional background, tend to think about the why for us as being relevant to whatever was our discipline of learning. And actually, cities are about taking all those disciplines and bringing them together in a merged contribution. And I hope that schools like the new urban design school here are bringing that kind of joined up approach. But maybe not. It is within the school of architecture and urban design. So I think it's going to be one of those situations where it will be about how the different departments within the university get together to create a joined up understanding across as many disciplines as possible as to what it is that goes to make up a successful city. So I've tried to think about what it is that might define a successful and sustainable city, and in order to make it relatively easy to talk about, I identified 5 drivers. Some of them are about understanding what's happening with cities, and this essentially is what Doug was talking about last night, and I really do encourage you to have a look at that book. And if you don't read the book, you won't get that actually, or if you didn't hear what Doug said last night, you won't necessarily get that what Doug is actually talking about is communities within cities as being the arrival places and not the whole city being the arrival place. And when you start to get your head around that, then, because otherwise it's almost too big a concept to grasp, and we've talked about that. We know what that looks like. And density, you know, is something that Vancouver knows all about, talks about, but it depends where you are. This was the work we were doing in Toronto as part of the C40 work we were doing there. This data, which is from Melbourne, relatively, well, it's recent in that it's got decals with the latest being 2009 to 10. Shows the decay in the price of housing as you move away from the centre of the city. And you can see how much in the last 10 years the demand for housing in the centre of the city has grown. And you can see that looks at it by the 4 main cities. And actually, you know, Brisbane, not Sydney or Melbourne, is the place where the demand is greatest. So that's an indication of what we know is happening in most cities, and it influences the way developers think about cities. And we had a very revealing and transparent conversation before dinner about the way developers think about cities. And, you know, in Australia, and I'm getting the feeling here, the only thing that's driving what happens in cities is the developers, because no one else has got any money. And in fact, that's what somebody said. So, in the context of design and planning, you know, okay, we know what it could be, but who's going to ask us to do it? I'll come back to that. So I believe as professionals or as people interested in cities, we know what makes cities vibrant and successful. Title or remove? Huh. Well done, David. You can tell I've been burning the midnight oil here. So, you know, that's a laneway in Melbourne where actually effort has been put in to turn that back into the sort of slightly gritty space that is where people want to be. And that, on the left, is in Docklands, which was developed by Lend-Lease, also in Melbourne, about 5 years ago, where they created sterile spaces where no one wanted to be. And there's a wind blowing in from Port Phillip Bay that on any sort of day means that you get blown away in that space. So, you know, we've got people who are trying to understand that it's places and people that go to make cities vibrant. Not necessarily, dare I say it, architects. I think architects are getting the message, but, you know, I think good architecture hasn't necessarily been synonymous with good people places. Just flicking through a few city projects that we've been involved with. Well, you know, and just to make another point about us as professionals having the skills, you know, we have the ability to understand what's happening in our cities. Here's something that's available in San Francisco that looks at the greenhouse gas emissions by suburb. And this is something that ARUP did for Auckland, looking at an energy strategy and understanding, how to actually make a sustainable energy strategy for Auckland work. Okay, and this is a city that, we all sort of think would be one of the examples of a great place to be. But it comes, I think you have to be a Dane to want to live in Copenhagen. I mean, it's a lovely place to go and visit. A lovely place to go and visit. But European cities are places that Europeans live in. And Australian cities are places where Australians live, and Canadian cities, etc. How well does it work to take a sort of idealised view, like the beautiful examples you gave of London town in Shanghai? Brilliant. Thames Town? Yeah, I mean, how well does it work to take an idealised view of what might be a good urban environment and put it somewhere else? I think, as professionals, we've got to be better than that. Well, this is something that's actually being built in Milan right now, ARUP project. Pretty amazing. I'm sure the landscaping bills or the body corporate bills will be significant. Okay, Singapore. Now, Singapore is a city that over the last 20 years has set out to change itself. And it has invested dramatically in changing itself. And it's even, encouraged people to dance on the tables in the bars along whatever you call that waterway. And they've tried to make themselves into a slightly gritty Asian city again, whereas they were very, very, very squeaky clean and you couldn't chew gum and so on and so forth. So Singapore is trying to create for itself a persona that is what they think is what people want. And maybe they've got it right, I don't know. But they've also encouraged, grand architecture, and as it happens, both of these are examples of the sort of work that ARUP does. ARUP wouldn't exist if it wasn't for people wanting to do these kinds of crazy projects. But they do say a certain something about the city, and they make it a place that people want to visit. And people will take a stopover in Singapore now, and instead of stopping over for a night on their way to London, they'll stay for 3 or 4 days, because there's a lot to do.